Hello and welcome to The Gist. I am your host, Chris Vetrano, here to break down all the things in pop culture and interviewing the people that make it pop. Today's guest is a true pop culture connoisseur. He's an author, a cultural critic, and the host of his wildly popular podcast, Shut Up, Evan. And according to White Lotus creator Mike White, he's the most valuable hype man in the history of television. So I cannot wait to hear what he is hyped up about today. So let's get right into it and welcome my guest, Evan Ross Katz. Welcome to The Gist.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I am so excited to have you. Obviously, both of us are pop culture lovers, connoisseurs of all things film, television, music, the things that really get our blood boiling. And you have really turned it from fan to fandom to influencer. And so I really want to get into that story with you today. But before we do, I'd love to kind of share just the baseline. I think I know the answer to this, but for our listeners, where did this really start? Where did you, what was the cultural moment or TV show or the thing that really turned you from fan to this fandom?
Yeah, I mean, my typical answer would be to say Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But I think more accurately, it would probably be shows like The View and The Oprah Winfrey Show and Total Request Live, particularly The Oprah Winfrey Show and Total Request Live, because those were both shows that were on when I came home from school.
Yeah.
And so there was that feeling that is very familiar to people of a certain age before there was YouTube and the internet, where when you got home, you had a few snacks and then you settled in to watch these shows. And funny enough, with something like TRL, you go back now and think about it, and it was the same videos being played every day. But as my fandom was developing around certain things, it became really critical to check in and see, was Christina Aguilera's What a Girl Wants going to be number 2 or number 1 that day? And when things slipped and she moved into the number 3 slot, it was kind of like, okay, well, who's taking over? Who's moving into number 2? So I became really interested in the machinations of how a show like that worked. And it's funny because I go back and look at it today and I consider it kind of quaint, right? Because as I said, it's you're watching the same videos over and over again. But I think that competitive aspect to the video, to where the video would be slotted, was something that really intrigued me. And the idea that the fans played a role in where the video would land on the countdown. And then Oprah too, just watching her interview all these people, some of whom are famous, some of whom just had interesting stories to tell. I just was gripped. And I also remember the attention on the audiences of these shows, those cutaways to the audience out in Times Square screaming. And when someone like Mariah Carey would go to the window and people outside would be, just losing their minds. I remember I wanted to be one of those people. And it was really crucial too, because I didn't want to be Mariah Carey. I wanted to be someone outside screaming up at Mariah Carey. And so I think that really indoctrinated me into the world of fandom and my intrigue, not just in being a fan, but everything around it. The idea that these are people that kind of like flowers need to, like plants need to be watered. And I was really interested in all of that, everything that surrounded that.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting because and the way that you said, I don't want to be the Mariah Carey at the window. I want to be the fan looking up at it, because I totally understand that. I think growing up, your friends want to be, a firefighter or an astronaut or Mariah Carey. And I wanted to be I want to be Simon Fuller and build the Spice Girls, or I want to be somebody in their posse. I want to be following Britney around. It was just, I didn't want to be the star. I didn't want to be the person. I wanted to be the person amplifying them. And so I've never thought of it from the TRL kind of lens, but that is a perfect kind of way of putting it. You mentioned obviously Buffy, and I know you wrote a book on your sort of obsessive fandom of Buffy and all of the history. I feel like I would not be doing my job to take care of my guest if I didn't ask, are you okay? Because we are on the heels of the news that the Buffy reboot is DOA. So Evan, are you okay?
I'm doing okay. I'm taking it day by day. It's definitely such an interesting relationship I have to this show, because I grew up watching, and it very much is, a part of the catalyst for my interest in pop culture and a lot of the work I do today. And then by some great force bigger than me, I was, Sarah Michelle Gellar and I's lives came together about almost 10 years ago now. And so I got to kind of meet my hero and become friends with my hero. And so I kind of have this like relationship with the show that is both incredibly like oriented around my obsession with it in my youth, and then also a very different relationship with it in adulthood, which is my proximity to obviously not just Sarah, but having written the book, learning a lot about how the sauce was made, which with anything where you learn more about how this thing that you previously were on the outside of, when you learn more about it, it's just going to complicate your relationship with the thing.
Mm-hmm.
With regard to the revival series, I'm sad for Sarah and the people who made the show, who I gather were really proud of this thing that they were making. And I say making and not made because, as Sarah has recently expressed, like pilot episodes are not the final product by any measure. Real fans of Buffy will know that there's an unaired pilot episode of Buffy that had a different actress playing Willow. It was a much shorter script. Like it was completely retooled when they finally made what was now known as the proper pilot episode of the show. So I think it's unfortunate that this has played out so publicly, but also that's something that wasn't done. There's actually, for Buffy fans, she makes a metaphor in the series finale of the show calling herself cookies. And she says that she's still baking. She's still cookie dough. And I feel like that metaphor is very apt for this Buffy revival series. It was very much still cookie dough, not yet cookies. And it was being incubated. And the idea that it's no longer moving forward, that's obviously disappointing. But the idea that people are coming out now, some people have read the leaked script. Some people are just simply prognosticating about what the show will be based off of the limited information that's out there. That's also disappointing to me because people aren't going to get to see the vision that the Zuckerman sisters and Sarah and Chloe and Gail Berman and all these people that were working on the show, what they were trying to make. So I'm sad, but I don't know if hopeful is the word, but I think that, everything happens for a reason. If we're meant to see this new iteration of the show, perhaps it will come to be someday. So yeah, but it's definitely like, I'm mostly just sad I know how hard it is to get something made in Hollywood. And so it's sad when something that seemed to have a lot of gas in the tank is suddenly, parked.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, perhaps it will find, life again. But I do also wonder your take. And I know you have a close relationship now with the show and with Sarah. And so, I imagine that there's some level of like how you think about answering these types of questions because you want to see success and you want to see the brand continue. But also as someone who was so passionate about what Buffy once was, is there any part of you that is fearful of what happens when shows get rebooted and what it could potentially do to maybe tarnish the brand?
You know what? It's such an interesting question because I think a lot about this because we live in this current climate it's pretty much the last 10 years where these like revival series have really become part of the norm. But if you really think about it, I feel like Arrested Development, when it came back all those years ago, was really, to my mind, the first series to really take a swing at this. And obviously now between Will and Grace and Just Like That and Fuller House, and there's just so many instances, and also smaller versions too. Like the Gilmore Girls did a revival that I think was like a 4-part like miniseries or something way back when. So there's lots of different ways in which this can exist. Also, a lot of these like look back podcasts that are now very popular, those are their own form of sort of, revisiting beloved IP. As far as like legacy and tarnishing the legacy, I'm not sure. I'm really interested in this conversation less than I have a strong opinion about it, but I understand the inclination as someone who loves things to be like wanting them to be preserved in a glass case. But there are other instances of really formative and important, pieces of art that have been reinterpreted later that didn't meet my standard of excellence that I sort of just don't remember. You know what I mean? Like out of mind, out of sight. I can't think of an instance in which something that I loved that attempted to come back and perhaps failed, like complicated my own relationship with the art. I also think I understand that for a lot of these shows, and this isn't across the board, but they were made at a very different time in terms of the financial structure of how things were made. And so I can certainly understand from a lot of the actors' perspectives and a lot of the writers and creatives that if you have a really popular IP and there's an opportunity in 2026 to revisit it and make more money off of it, I think that can sound really like to people outside of the industry. I imagine it can perhaps sound like really capitalist and very sort of just like money hungry and sort of done with ill intent. But I think that if people really better understood how a lot of the structure worked way back when these shows were made, they could understand why people want to take this thing and have it be equal parts giving something to the fans, but also an opportunity to work on something that they probably felt very passionately about, that there's an opportunity to work on again.
Mm.
So, yeah, I think that, I guess it's like something to me, it's kind of like a reality of where the industry is going in terms of this, this obsession with revisiting IP. And I think it's a case by case. On the whole, I would love if more original ideas were brought forth. But I also like, using the Buffy revival as an example, I got chills when I found out that there was going to be a Buffy revival. It's exciting when you hear that actors you love, franchises you love are being reconsidered. And also, as Sarah Michelle Gellar just said in a recent interview, people were saying to her, well, what can we do now that the show's not on? And her two suggestions were go and watch the original Buffy or go see my new movie. And I think that's a great example of like, if you love these things and they're brought back into the culture in some capacity, look back podcast, revival series, what have you, it's a great opportunity to indoctrinate new fans into this thing. So the fact that in 2026, Buffy is all over the news. Sarah Michelle Gellar is on the cover of People magazine. People are talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I'm going to choose to view that as a net positive.
Yeah. It is such an interesting thought because like I wasn't like a big Buffy fan at the time. I was a huge Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie fan, but my version of that was Beverly Hills 90210. Like I lived for that decade. I grew up with them. I felt like this was that is my version of your Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and they did a reboot several years ago. And I felt the same way. I wanted it for so many years. I was like, wouldn't it be great if we like found out what the gang was up to now? And then they announced that it was coming back. And then they like did it in this other kind of way where they were actually not their characters. They were themselves talking about the characters. And it didn't really land. And, I don't think that it tarnished the brand for me because it kept itself as like sort of this unique own, a completely separate series. But it also had been another rebooted series on the CW years prior where they had 90210 with a whole new cast, and they kind of tried to like blend both worlds, and I didn't really like feel anything towards that. And so that's where I was curious about your take on like how the Buffy reboot would have potentially landed with you, because I still feel very much like a fan of what they created in the 90s, and I appreciate what they have created since then, but I don't need those things as much to still
Yeah,
feel
yeah,
very
yeah.
close to it.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you. I don't need more Buffy. I was not among those who was hankering for more. I felt very satisfied by the original run of the series, but I understand the inclination from fans who love a thing to want it to exist anew. I don't like I said, though I don't share that perspective, I completely understand it. And if there is a new offering of Buffy, but also of anything that I once loved, I will certainly tune in. So, yeah, like I said, disappointed, but what will be, and I'll be tuning in to see what happens.
Yeah. Um, and so I want to dive into more because you mentioned, as you were talking about Buffy, your world collided with Sarah, and you have had that moment now many times. Your guest lists are insane. You host your dinners, which is just like so fun to see the insane grouping of people that you pick and curate to come to your dinner. I am curious, like, what was that transition for you, and how did that sort of take place where you went from coming home every day from school watching TRL and Oprah to sitting with all of these celebrities at dinner?
Yeah, so I was working for a now defunct media company called Mic.com, MIC.com, and I started there as a style editor. I was working in the style desk, doing predominantly fashion focused content. But as someone that was really active on Twitter and other social media sites at that time, like many people, I saw the things that were of interest were celebrity focused. And so I really started to skew a lot of our fashion coverage around front rows at fashion weeks, red carpet coverage to see what celebrities were, what outfits they were wearing at premieres and various events. And I was seeing the clicks, right? Because we had access to the back end. And I was like, wow, people are really obsessed with celebrity. And there was an initiative internally at the company with Facebook at the time to kind of, this is a very, uh, what's the word? This is a term that is like very triggering to a lot of media people like myself who existed in this ecosystem at the time. But there was an incentive
Mm.
to pivot to video, and there were opportunities to do more stuff on camera, and a lot of that was interviewing. And so it was kind of like a natural next step to have talent, the talent that we had been talking about, to have them come in and give them the opportunity to talk. And I think it was sort of like, who's around and available to do this? I can't say it was ever an aspiration of mine or something that I'd ever considered doing myself, though I've always been, when it comes to whether it be Barbara Streisand or Diane Sawyer or Charlie Rose, I've always just been an admirer. Or I mean, even today, I mean, looking at Terry Gross, Sam Fragoso, like they're just, I have so much admiration for really great interviewers. But again, never something that I saw myself doing. But so I was put on camera and I liked doing it. I thought it was a lot of fun. And the more I did it, the more I learned about, oh, if I wait and pause after my question and give it more space, it allows that, excuse me, after they start to answer my question, if I wait before asking my next question, often they will continue talking and something interesting might come from it. So I was just kind of like learning a lot of the skills that go into good interview. One of the big conversations happening on the internet at the moment is around who gets to interview. And there's a lot of conversation about quote unquote celebrity journalism. And I think that people have really strong opinions about who should be asking the questions, what those questions should be. And I think there's a lot of confusion as to what we want out of an interview with a celebrity. Is the goal to have them reveal some aspect of themselves? Is the goal to have them share something that makes us feel bonded to them? Like the kind of like, oh, celebs, they're just like us.
Mm.
Is the goal simply viral content? Is the goal to get a sense of their sensibilities, what they're watching, what they're consuming, the things that they like, etc.? So all of that was sort of being hashed out as I did these interviews. And then I got laid off from Mike.com in 2018. And I was kind of trying to figure out how I could take a lot of that and do something else with it. And for a while, I was freelance writing. And so I would write for a bunch of different publications and really pitch myself to do celebrity profiles. And then in 2020, I was like, I should start a podcast and start seeking out these people and doing it myself. And it was very, as many people who put themselves on a mic feel in the beginning, it was sort of like trial by fire,
Mhm.
figuring it all out. I can definitely look back at a lot of those early interviews. My style has completely changed, but again, it's one of those muscles. And so the more I was exercising it, I don't want to say better I became, because I don't even think it's like I don't look back at those and think that those are bad. And I don't look at what I do today as necessarily good, but my approach is just completely different. I think I was way more attached to a structure in the
Mm.
beginning and writing down my questions and getting through the questions. And then over time, you just start to realize you're like, wow, like I'm never getting to questions 11 through 20. So, okay, maybe I need to get rid of questions 11 through 20. But then you're like, well, wait, but I loved question 15. So then
Mm.
you're like, okay, so then maybe I make 20 questions and then I do a second pass and whittle those 20 questions down to the best 10.
Mhm.
And then from there, you have 10, but then you start to ask yourself, okay, well, what's the best way into an interview? Is the first question, do you want a softball, something of like how are you? What'd you have for breakfast? How's your week going? Something to ease us in? Or there's the alternative approach where you go in right now and, as you sort of did, Buffy's in the headlines right now. How are you feeling about this trending topic? That's also an approach. there's no right or wrong, but one of the great things about doing the podcast in the early days, especially when a lot of people weren't listening, is you have time to fine tune and figure out your style, what you like, and what makes people the most comfortable or engaged. Or if you're someone that's hoping to catch people off guard, which is not my style, but you learn how to deploy different tactics. So I think it was just starting off in traditional media. And then I would say podcasting was really the thing that allowed me the chance to interview who I wanted to in the form that I wanted.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting too, because I do love, there's like such a sincerity when you do it, when you host an interview, and there is something that like feels very organic. So hearing you kind of like, share your process and how you get to that is very much like how I feel like I approach this. Like I say this a lot on my podcast. Like I have another day job. I don't really need to podcast. I've had a career in the music industry and in the entertainment space for many years. And I simply just love having conversations. And it was something that during COVID and then post COVID and remote work and all of this stuff, I wanted to really just do it for myself. Like I wanted to start having conversations with like-minded people and, be able to help amplify stories. It's hard because there's so many podcasts and there's so many people that are doing it for clickbait or are trying to find like that juicy, salacious thing to like have people talk about. And I just like don't have that kind of agenda when I walk into a conversation. And something that I really enjoyed on a recent episode of yours, when you interviewed Hudson, you did like a foreword on how you prepared for that interview. And I found that so fascinating of like, you were like, I walked into that interview and I knew I don't want to talk about heated rivalry, which is like kind of mind blowing when you really think about it, because like that is what everyone's talking about. And that is, you were the first podcast that he did, and you had this like opportunity to really bring the heated rivalry brand to the conversation. And instead you did something that even before you got into the questioning, you mentioned like he takes off his shoes, he gets comfortable. Like there's something that you do with the way in which you interview and the way in which you tell people's stories or allow people to tell their stories through the platform that you're providing. It just feels like home to them. And I think that that makes for such a better conversation. And I think because of that, or I would love your thoughts, is like, because of the kind of care that you take with your guests, do you feel like it's opened doors for the bigger names and the next level celebrities and the people that are maybe more reserved in doing interviews on TV or with other kind of outlets?
That's interesting. Well, to go to the first point, first of all, thank you for saying that. That's very kind of you. I think a lot about the work that I and many other people do in this space. Like, I think it deserves framing sometimes. I often think about the work I do as being spotlighting things, and the whole idea of a spotlight creates the idea of everything outside of the spotlight, right? Like the idea that there's a light being shown, but then there's things around the periphery of that light. And so for me, I want to, in instances like the one you're referencing, be able to invite people in to understand how details that you might not notice or you might notice and think don't factor in any way. And so in that instance, when you're talking about choosing not to like talk about heated rivalry, that kind of begins with my research process. As I was doing my research, I just was like, every question that I would jot down, I would find the answer to it in some story that had been written or some other interview that they had done. And so I used that as a cue to say, I bet you that like, I think this earth has been turned. And so I was like, I need to find a new patch of land, right? It just didn't feel like, some people would say, okay, well, there's an opportunity to go deeper. But I just didn't feel that way. Like that wasn't what really motivated me in that interview. And so, or I think about the interview that I did with Jesse Buckley and Paul Mescal for Hamnet, where I watched a bunch of interviews and people kept framing the movie as like, you're going to leave the theater with your entire box of tissues in your pocket. You'll just be weeping. And while I don't disagree with that, I very much found the first third, if not the first half of the film, to be like a very traditional love story. And I felt like that aspect of the film wasn't really being conveyed in a lot of what I was reading about the film. And so it occurred to me that they probably would be keen to talk about the first half of the film to contextualize like what gets us to the quote unquote tearjerker moment. So a lot for me is about like figuring out what are the things that I either don't think that they're being asked about a ton, or using what they are being asked about a ton to deviate and find some other area to discuss. And then to answer your question about like access, I think that it's honestly like, yes, I do think like the more I do this and the more that I can use examples of past interviews to go out to talent and say, like, this is what I do. And I would love to give you, like, we could do this thing together. That's really helpful. But also, part of this is like there's the world of publicists and managers and agents and studios. And so a lot of it is when you have when you're lucky enough to have a platform these days, and you can get a couple of big names in the door, there are going to be studios that executives, what have you, that see that a famous person on a platform that is coming off favorably, and they're going to say, I want to replicate that. So I think a lot of it is success begetting success. And so I think that, a writer friend told me way back in the day when I was beginning my career, shout out to Sam Lansky, he said you need three bylines. And this was like the real beginning of digital media. He said you need three bylines to really establish yourself as a writer on three different publications. And it was so true. Once I wrote for three different publications, I then had not just three articles, but I had three different flavors of article to send. It's like, oh, here's a story I wrote for Playboy, and then here's a story I wrote for Huffington Post. And it sort of gives you that range. And I think it's similar in this space, which is like, once you show that, like, I can do the really serious, heavy interview, I can do the interview that's like making someone who's controversial look good. I can do something that's bringing a cast of characters together and having them in conversation with one another. I can do a panel. I can do a group conversation. I can do a reunion. Once you sort of flex all of your capabilities as an interviewer, it invites more opportunities.
Yeah, I do wonder though, because then there is this element now where a lot of these people that were, guests or people that you've interviewed or that you've gotten access to over the years are now, I think you would consider many of them friends, Sarah obviously being one of them. How does that show up, if at all, differently when you think about like covering something that one of them, like, let's just use Sarah as the example, like for her new film. If you were going to write about the film, is it in the back of your mind that like, this is my friend and I have a responsibility to this person more so than the words that I put on paper,
Yeah.
or not?
Well, this is such an interesting conversation because I feel like it's really bubbling up right now on social media. I'm seeing a lot of people sort of like discuss this topic and adjacent topics to it. I would say for me personally, I was a journalist for the first maybe decade of my career. I started working at Thrillist when I came out of college and worked at a bunch of different publications. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, Mike.com was the last formal publication I worked for, although I did have a column at Paper Magazine. At that point, and also even when I was at Paper, I was a columnist, which is very different than a journalist. I still do some journalism on the side with places like British Vogue and Elle and when opportunities come my way. But I would say it depends on where I'm writing about it, right? So if I'm writing about Ready or Not 2 for my newsletter, I'm going to be hyperbolic and I'm going to approach it with a sort of like that eye of being a fan. I'll probably be very explicit about that fact as well.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were hired by Vanity Fair to write a review of Ready or Not 2, I would see that responsibility very differently. And it would be my obligation in taking on that assignment to be truthful about how I feel and to be as close to objective as I can be. So I think it's a matter of recognizing that different mediums rely on different skill sets. But I think that in general, even if I went and saw Ready or Not 2, and I was like, this is the next Shakespeare in Love. If I was like, this is the film, I still don't think I would write about it for a Vanity Fair or something. I think I would enjoy more going on my Substack and getting to use sycophantic language in talking about and hyping up this film. So I just don't think that when it comes to things that I have proximity to, I don't think I pursue opportunities that ask me to have the integrity necessary to speak about them with a journalistic perspective.
Yeah. And even on your Substack though, because you share your opinion about something, if there is someone that you maybe don't know or a project that you're not connected to or don't have access to directly, is it now because of your platform, is it in the back of your head that you should maybe tread lightly so that you potentially could interview somebody in the future?
It's an interesting question. I wouldn't say tread lightly, but I would say I think part of this comes from doing this for a long time and also being older, and then also recognizing a shift that's happened, which is the way in which clips, whether it be from podcasts like this or even paragraphs of writing in a written story, the way they get extracted without context on the internet. And now that's kind of just become parlance. So I would say I have more of a mindfulness when it comes to both the questions that I ask and the things that I write about. I interrogate my own perspective a bit more and try and make it a little bit more airtight, as to say, if this paragraph were taken out or if this response were taken out, is it going to completely, and without context, is it going to completely mean the opposite, or am I leaving too much opportunity for this to be received with the viciousness that I think the internet so often receives things with? But in terms of like how to answer your question directly, like, yes, my approach does change because I work with a lot of these brands as well in doing sponsored content on my page. And so I think that part of the deal that I've made through my work is being purposeful about, you're not going to see me doing sponsored content for a show I don't like. I would turn down that opportunity, but there are times that I might see something that like a past version of myself would call out a detail in this or something that I felt one way or the other about that I just wouldn't speak to today. But I think some of that too is like, the older I get, the more I don't feel as compelled when it comes to the things that I don't like. My compulsion goes to the group chat
Hmm.
more than it does to social media. Um, and I also think the older I get, the more understanding I have. And I said this in the beginning talking about Buffy. I know how difficult it is to get things made. And I have so much respect. You mentioned the 90210 reboot, and like, I'm with you. I didn't love it, but I appreciate the big swing that they took with that concept. And so, like, that's an example of like, even though I didn't like that reboot, I wouldn't go online and shit on it because I appreciate them not resting on their laurels
Hmm.
and actually like making a bold choice. And sometimes bold choices don't work, but what I want to see more of in Hollywood and beyond is bold choices. So I think it's more, I try and be more selective about the things that I talk about. And yes, I understand too that like the work that I do, especially in interviewing talent, is access based, right? And so, yeah, but I mean, I know that this is where that conversation gets tricky around like the journalism versus interviewer, entertainment journalists versus traditional journalists. And it's a lot of new nomenclature for a lot of people to understand the variety of these roles. Even red carpet reporting is a very different skill set, which I do that sometimes, but it's very different than what I do on a podcast. Or when I'm doing a print interview, is that's also totally different, right? Because if I'm sitting down with someone, I profiled Brooke Shields a few years back, and like, we're having lunch together and there's a recorder. Everything we're saying is being recorded, but she and I both know I'm going to use maybe 5 or 6 quotes from that interview. Whereas if we're on a podcast, every single thing she says is going to be included. So there's more opportunity if you're Brooke for like a throwaway comment or just like making something that you know is not going to go in the piece. All this to say, it's like they're very different formats. And I think, like many, I'm kind of learning as we venture into this new media landscape.
Yeah. It's interesting because when as you're saying this too, I am thinking a lot about how, like, honestly, like the social media, the way in which the landscape is shifting, like, actually made me pause on whether or not I, like, really wanted to be doing this. Because again, I'm not doing this for clicks. I'm not doing this, like, to get gotcha questions so that, like, I get a million followers and all of the things. Like, I really truly am doing it for my own kind of soul. But there's an element of it that, like, of course, I want people to enjoy it and I want people to consume it. But the internet and the way in which fandom, like going back to our, like you and I sitting at home after school watching TRL and Oprah and all of those things, that's like we shared our opinions with ourselves or our friends or our family was in the living room watching those things with us. Now everything takes to the internet in such a way. And so it's so interesting to hear you talk about like your perspective on the written versus doing something like this live where every word you say is going to be dissected. And I almost go back to my like question is like, that almost feels like such a responsibility of yours, like when you have these guests, because now when you're on a podcast with them, like you could use every single word that they say and turn it into, or someone could turn it into clickbait in some kind of way. And I just wonder like how that, if that gives you any kind of sense of pressure when you're doing those interviews.
It doesn't give me pressure. It makes me feel a pressure. I mean, even in this circumstance right now where I am on the other side of it, when I'm the one interviewing, I'm in control, right? Like I'm spearheading this journey. So I know which direction we're going to go. And if we start to zig, I can zag. If you're on the other side of it, if you're the one being asked the questions, you are relinquishing control. Even let's say you were to ask me something that I wasn't comfortable answering, if you go ahead and ask it and I were to like freeze up and be like, next question, that can be clipped out. I mean, I don't think I'm the kind of, I don't think I'm at a level where that would happen. But if you're a famous person and you're backed into a corner, even a non-answer can itself be a moment that gains traction. So yes, I do think about that. I think that the results of that, and I think this is more felt by people that have had an eye on this industry for quite some time, is there's just a general caginess around celebrity, and it's by necessity. I understand that. So it's a funny position I'm in where I'm interviewing these people and want them to open up and be comfortable and hopefully be vulnerable, while also understanding that even if that comfort and vulnerability is the closest thing to sincere possible, because I don't, sincerity to me as a concept with celebrity is a sort of like false prophet, but as close to sincere as possible, I would say. Even if that is where we land, it can be used against them by people that just don't like them or want to find a reason to, eviscerate someone. So it definitely, it's something that impacts me less. And it's more something I think about with the people that I speak to. And I don't have a solution for it so much as an awareness.
Yeah. Um, I am realizing like I could talk to you for a long time, which is why you're so good at what you do, because it feels very comfortable to have conversation. Before I let you go, I do want to talk a little bit about the chaos dinners and like how that came to be and kind of what your process is when you're selecting people to be in the room. It kind of, to tie it back to what we were just saying, is like there are a lot of people that have said things about one another or have history in the industry that I've seen you bring together and sit at at the same table for dinner. And so I'm just curious, like how all of that kind of goes into your process when and putting it together.
Yeah. So I will tell you, the next Chaos Dinner is happening in just a few weeks, which I'm really excited about. And so I look forward to, I'm like in the process of doing this once again. I would say it begins by, I just constantly am keeping a list. And sometimes this is utilized for the Chaos Dinner, sometimes for Shut Up Evan, sometimes just more generally. And I'm just keeping an eye on like, who are people talking about? Who is in the conversation? And like an example of that, obviously there's the people like the Zendayas that are always in the conversation, but like Jesse Metcalf is an example of someone who he just appeared on a podcast recently, and the clip populated on my feed, and I was like, wow. First I was like, he looks great, and then I was like, wow, he's being really introspective and sounds really smart, and so I wrote him down on my list. I was like, Jesse Metcalf, he's out and about, and he's got something to say. So I'm just constantly putting names in a list and like I said, utilized for different things, but just trying to keep track of like who are the people that are in the ether, right? And that can go, I was going to say from A to Z list, but I don't even think it's that. I wouldn't even say that's the categorization necessarily, but just people that are interesting to me. And also, it's not always celebrities. Sometimes it's just really great writers. Sometimes it's people making really interesting content on social and people whose opinions that I think are really worth highlighting. There is a cinematographer who, during the height of Heated Rivalry, was posting like all of these behind the scenes not behind the scenes rather, she was breaking down how these shots were constructed. And I was like, wow, like this is so not only informative, but I was like, she is so knowledgeable about this aspect of production that I know nothing about. And so I started following her, and now I'm on the journey with her as she posts new and other exciting discoveries. So I'm just kind of always accumulating a list of people that I think are interesting. And within that, I'm trying to find people that I think are there are some people who are interesting to like see the content they're making, but there are some people that instigate a desire in me to hear more from them. Like, for instance, the one that comes to mind, Ashley Padilla, from Saturday Night Live. She's done one, like, big interview so far, but, like, I'm hoping to have her on Shut Up Evan very soon because 'cause I'm like, when I see her, it's like it instigates questions in my mind. Like, where did that comedic sensibility come from? I
Hmm.
read that she used to be Diane Keaton's assistant. I'm like, I wanna know more about that. That's an example of, like, it spurs something in me that makes me wanna have a conversation. So she, to me, is someone who would be like a prime example of someone I'd want at the chaos dinner because the chaos dinner is really mostly it's a creating an atmosphere of really interesting people and it's not people that are interesting in like headlines per se because a dinner party is very different than just having people at a big splashy event or something, right? Having people like a film premiere for instance, there's no like social component. It's really about having a picture on a step and repeat and saying this celebrity was in this place. Whereas the chaos dinner is really much more intimate. So for me, it's just a matter of trying to figure out who are the people that I would love to see in conversation with one another. I loved that like at the second chaos dinner that I did 2 years ago, I sat Katie Couric next to Lucas Gage. And they became like really good friends by the end of the night. But that was an example of like, I know Katie Couric's a lot of fun. And I know Lucas is a lot of fun. And I was like, I think they're going to have a really good time together. And so it's just trying to find pairings and pockets of people that you're like, wow, I can't imagine these two people together. I mean, I had another one when I was planning the third one. I had Gabby Windy there, and I had Melanie Linsky there as well.
Hmm.
And I asked Melanie in advance. I was like, "Are you a fan of the Traders?" And she's like, "Am I a fan of the Traders?" And again, I'm like, okay, perfect. It's like I want to put someone, and obviously Gabby Windy's a human, so she's a fan of Melanie Linsky, as so many of us are. But it was an instance of like trying to provoke a pairing based off of like, okay, I know that this person knows about this person. I will say sometimes it could be really fun to put someone next to Gabby Windy who has no idea who Gabby is because Gabby's so magnetic. So it's not always a matter of like, does this person know this person? But like so much of the work I do, it's really just trying to find like, different combinations that I think are going to excite.
Yeah. And then like what is the intent though? Like because you mentioned like a red carpet event at a film premiere, but is the intent a content moment? Is it networking? Is it a cultural experiment? I mean, is it all three of those things? Like what is the intent?
Yeah, which is a great question. So it's evolved, right? So now when I do these chaos dinners, they're in partnership with a specific show. So for instance, the last chaos dinner I did was in partnership with HBO and the White Lotus. And so I invited, I think there were 8 of the White Lotus cast members that were there at the dinner, and they're kind of like the anchors of the dinner. And so for this fourth iteration that's coming up in a few weeks, I'm doing it with Netflix and with Beef season 2. And so it will be the cast of Beef is the anchors, and then we build out everything around that. So the intention, and also the second chaos dinner was with Bridgerton. So Nicola Coughlan and Luke Newton were at that dinner. And what began as sort of just like a let's get lots of bodies in the room has become ultimately an event that is in promotion of something new. And so we kind of see it, when I do a toast, it's that room is celebrating the launch of this thing. But as I did, with the White Lotus one, I make sure to go in my speech and go around the room. I mention who we have in this room and all of the categories of culture that they touch because I want it to be a celebration, not just of the show, but of just all the hard work that these people do. Again, when you have so many of them in a room together sitting at a table, these people drive so much of the cultural conversation. And so, as someone like you who loves this shit, I want to make sure these people know that the work they're doing, whether it be a prestige drama on a big streamer or a reality competition show, it impacts us. We spend a lot of our time with these people. They matter to us, and so I want them to feel celebrated.
Yeah. Well, and celebrate them you do. You do such, as I've said many times, like I feel like you do something that I certainly admire. And, listening to your interviews and the way in which the thing you talked about giving space is something that I really had to learn. Like I took to the mic for this podcast and really had never done an interview before. I had never been thrown in front of the camera to kind of do that. And I felt like I always had to be talking. And I remember
Yeah.
like early on, because podcasts were kind of new for everybody. And so even some of the guests like weren't talking as much, and it was like there can never be silence, and so we have to like always fill it. And then I started listening to some of the early episodes and I was like, I think it's just me talking, and like the guest is like not getting a word in, and I was like, well, I've got to like totally change, and like how do I ask the question that's just going to let them go? And because that's what I want to hear
Yeah.
from my guest. And so you have done that so beautifully. And I feel like if you've given me any tips just from listening through your podcast, but then also today has just been so wonderful. So I thank you for again coming on and sharing your story and being, the pop culture fan that you are, because you, just like all of the people in the room at the Chaos Dinner, are giving something to people like me and the fans of pop culture. And so thank you for your efforts and all of the work that you do to deliver that to us.
Well, thank you. One thing that I learned from Terry Gross that I apply often that is really helpful is I used to think that I always had to be asking a question. And one thing that I do a lot now is I simply make a statement to the person, because I think just an innate aspect of conversation is the flow. And if I feel like I've established a flow with the person, how they start to understand my vocal patterns, what I'll do is something akin to like, if it's Kate Winslet, it's like, in 1997, you appeared in Titanic. Titanic's box office crossed 2 billion. And then I'll just leave it. And she, if we've established a rhythm, is going to jump in there and say, can you believe it? Or that's crazy. It's just, so it's not always about setting up a question. Sometimes it's about a statement and then the inflection in the statement. And I think when you do that, it frees up the conversation to be less them under the gun to like the inquisition of it all,
Mm-hmm.
and it allows them to feel more of a conversational flow. So that's one thing that Terry taught me that I really try to apply, is just making statements sometimes, especially when it's a fact of like, I'm going to read you back this quote that you said in 1997.
Mm.
And then you finish reading it. And sometimes they might say, is there a question? And then maybe you might have to think of one on the fly. But other times they're going to be like, yeah, it's funny hearing that back now because my opinion on that has completely changed.
Mm.
And so I sort of like the laying something down and not quite knowing where it's going to go. Whereas like with a question and answer, it's a little bit more standardized, which can be safe and which can be easy. But I sort of like the trying to lay down some groundwork that's a little bit like not exactly sure the route that we're going to take.
Yeah. No, it's so true. And the best, like I always hear from listeners that the best episodes are the ones that like the conversations that I didn't realize we were going to have because they went in a completely different direction. You talked about your 20 questions, and like sometimes I end and I'm like, oh, I got to like one of my questions.
Totally.
And then we totally talked about something I didn't know we were going to.
And
And it was
sometimes
so
it's
good.
like, sometimes I only get to one question and I'm like, fuck, I wish I would have gotten to the other 19. And sometimes I'm like, we didn't even need the other 19. You're never going to know. Like sometimes deviating will be a bad thing. You might have been like, I wish I had stuck to the script more.
Mm.
But that's the joy of getting to do what you and I do, which is that you've got the next interview to finesse the thing that you didn't get right at the last one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I certainly, I have a lot here that we never talked about, because you do actually do a lot of things. You work with so many brands and shows and FX Beauty, and, you have so many things that we just didn't even talk about. And of course, now here we are at the end, but I really did enjoy the conversation with you. But before we go, why don't you just plug some of the things that you have going on, where people can find you and where they can start the conversation with you in your group chat?
Yeah, they can check out. I'm going to be hosting the Comeback Season 3 companion podcast, which
Oh
will
my
be
gosh.
available on HBO Max and on YouTube and where you listen to all podcasts. It's going to be a weekly after show that features myself, series creator Michael Patrick King, and co-creator, co-executive producer, and star Lisa Kudrow. We are doing all of the episodes together.
Right.
Additionally, we have an incredible lineup of guest stars, including Benito Skinner and John Early and Laura Silverman and Ella Stiller and some other big names, which we have not yet announced. But so that will be out this Sunday with the season 3 premiere of the show. I have my Chaos Dinner 4 coming up in mid-April. And then I would say stay very tuned for a big announcement coming soon about Shut Up Evan's future.
Amazing. I'm so, like, again, honored that you did this today. I just think that the world of what you've done, and I think that you've taken the fan to fandom to influencer to now brand in such a lovely way, and I have been just enamored by it all. So thank you again for being on today. Good luck with the dinner and all that you have. I can't believe we didn't talk about the comeback, especially as we were talking about reboots, because my God, do they know how to do it right?
They sure do. This new
And
season's so exciting.
I can't wait to tune into the podcast. But you are at Evan Ross Katz on social media. So if you haven't already followed him, do that. And of course, subscribe to Shut Up Evan, both the newsletter and the podcast, and apparently potentially some new opportunities coming there. But again, Evan, thanks so much. And thank you all for listening. Until next time, I'm Chris Vetrano, and that's the gist.